Hey, this is John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. I've finished this build of Tamiya's 1/48 scale F4U-2 Corsair. I gave it the United States Marine Corps markings. It's a night fighter, and it's in the early blue-gray over light gray scheme that was seen on many of the aircraft in the Navy and the Marines before they switched to the very familiar tricolor camo. This is, if you know Tamiya, you know this is a great kit. It fits so very well, and there's really no problems in the construction at all that I ran into. You may have heard that Tamiya is often described as shake and bake. You know, you just put a bottle of glue in the box and shake it around and a model falls out. It's about that easy to build this thing. The model is reasonably well detailed. The cockpit interior is very good. Certainly if you're someone who likes adding a lot of photo etch or resin or doing scratch building, there's plenty of opportunity for that. But straight out of the box, with some paint and some shade and some highlights, it really builds up into something that looks pretty cool. I did use an ultracast seat in this model rather than go with the kit supplied seat, simply because the ultracast seats have cast-in seat belts, and I think they look really good. In fact, on any aircraft, World War II aircraft build that I do, I always make sure to use an ultracast seat. They're just great quality. They look good. When you paint them up and add some washes to them, they just really pop. And when you're looking into the cockpit of most World War II fighters, the seat is what you see. So having a really good seat in there will help make that stand out even more. I used Tamiya paints for the exterior of the model. XF18 medium blue was used for the upper surfaces, and XF19 sky gray was used for the lowers. It was done in multiple coats. I put down the base color for each of the respective colors to the top and the bottom, and then I used XF2 white to lighten those down and do some panel shading and streaking and just some things to give it a little bit of a patchy, worn appearance. So it's not necessarily, if you're thinking in terms of FS colors, it's not FS color accurate, but it's close enough, I think, for government work. And once the weathering is put on top of it, I think it ends up looking the part. The model went through several stages of weathering. I initially did, as I mentioned, the modeling with the lighter shades of the base colors in order to give it a patchy and sun-faded and streaked appearance. On top of that, I used various oils for streaking. I did some splattering with different oil colors and then did some streaking once they dried. The panel lines are an enamel wash that I didn't worry about cleaning up too much. I mostly blended in any excess. If there was a large area, I wiped it away, but I really wanted to give it a grimy but not overly weathered appearance. I didn't want it to appear as if it were sitting in the junkyard, but maybe to suggest an aircraft in its early deployment, but having been used quite heavily. My goal when I build an aircraft like this is not so much to have things look scale accurate if you're examining it from, you know, holding it in your hand and sticking your eye right up to it where you're 2 or 3 inches away. I don't think that's really realistic in terms of how most models are viewed. So I try to go for a look that works when viewed from a foot, maybe 2 feet away. So it exaggerates some of the detail, but it's done so that when viewed from a little further away, what I think of as normal viewing distance, then it appears correct. I think when people are looking at a model, they have a certain expectation of reality And while they're not necessarily thinking scale reality, they are looking for certain visual markers and visual cues that show, okay, this is a representation of a real object. So that's what I've tried to do with the weathering and the various stains and chips and streaks around the model. I went a little heavier on the weathering on the undersides, making the assumption that as it would take off and land from a less than perfect airstrip, that would get a little grimier, a little dirtier. And so I wanted to add some mud stains after the wheels, and of course some exhaust stains and other kind of staining. I added some exhaust or some gun staining aft of the ejector chutes where the shells would fall out. I did a little, just a very slight amount on the leading edge where the gun openings are. I'm not a real big fan of the massive streaks of cordite coming back from those that I often see on models. While you do see some examples of that on aircraft, more likely you're just like, you know, you're more apt to see just a little bit of staining right there at the opening. So I tried to keep it subtle. The engine is a nice representation of the engine for this scale. I did add a little bit of wiring just to give it some additional visual interest, but because of the tight cowl and the large propeller hub in front of it, you don't really see a lot of it. So I didn't worry too much about getting into heavy detailing of the engine. On the upper surfaces, I used a technique that's often employed in armor modeling. I took various shades of oil paints, light grays and blues, and just some things that would be appropriate for the surface of this model. And I used a splattering technique I actually used a toothpick and a brush to flick paint across the surface of the model. And I did this in multiple layers with multiple colors to try and give the appearance of something that's been sitting out in the sun, something that has had water land on it, dry, more water land on it, wash stuff off, and it gives I think a really cool appearance. After the oils dried, the various splatters, I used a soft brush to go in and just blend them a bit and streak them a bit so that they weren't too stark. And then of course I also knew that when I put on the matte coat, that would tone everything down a bit also. I used a Prismacolor silver pencil for the chipping, and I do the chipping in several stages. I do it shortly after putting on the decals and doing the panel lining, and that establishes what I call the old chips, because later weathering steps will dull that down, and then I'll either one or two more times in the process, kind of mid-weathering and at the end of the weathering, enhance some of the chips with the Prismacolor silver pencil so that it gives the appearance of multiple ages of chips. Some things that chipped away and have sat and haven't been chipped again, and then maybe other things have received additional chipping. I also added in some chipping using a mechanical pencil just to make some of those areas look darker and even more worn, and as if the steel had been exposed for quite a while, the underlying aluminum, whatever the material was. So hopefully it adds to the depth of the finish, and ultimately that's what I go for in finishing any model that I'm weathering, is I want depth of finish. I don't want it to just look like a single layer of stuff has been streaked on, but that you see multiple layers and it represents ages of, you know, the various weathering. For the fuel stain, I always have fun doing the fuel stains. What I start with is just putting some odorless enamel where I want the stain to be. I put it on fairly heavily and just let it naturally run down the side of the model. You have to make sure that the model is sitting at the angle it will sit at when it's finished. So if you don't have the landing gear on, you may want to dry fit them or at least prop it up at the appropriate angle. But once I have the wet odorless enamel thinner in place, I just start putting dots of oil where that thinner is flowing, and the thinner just kind of takes care of the staining. It pulls it down the side. It makes it look like a natural stain that's running down the side, because that's what it's actually doing. After I let it dry, then I can go in with a brush and kind of stipple things around and clean up any obvious pooling or swirls that don't look natural. And it gives it a pretty nice fuel stain look, I think. The staining on the underside is always fun, and again, I do this in multiple layers. I'll start off with just some basic stains aft of various ports and panel lines where I think there might be staining, and I streak the oils around a bit and get that generally looking a little grimy, and then I'll go in and add more stains adjacent to those, in some places on top of those. And you may have to do this over a period of hours or even days to allow the oils to dry a bit, so you're not just streaking them over and over. But again, it gives a depth of finish that I think really pays off in the end. I also added a few different colors. It's still browns and mud tones and things like that, but just something to give a little bit of visual interest. And then I also leave a few areas clean so that there is some contrast, and I think it helps better sell the notion of a streaked, grimy appearance on the underside of the model. The fit of this model overall is very good. There aren't any large gaps to deal with or any problems with that. Of course, there are seams that have to be dealt with. No matter how good the fit is, there's always going to be an area where two plastic parts meet, and you have to do something to address that. The main areas that you'll see it on this model are along the upper part of the cowl here, along the spine, and on the underside, and the leading edges of the wings. All of those are easy to deal with because the fit is so good. If you use a cement like Tamiya extra thin cement that actually slightly melts the plastic when you put it together, if you squeeze the parts together, you'll get a bead of glue that will rise up. Give that 24 to 48 hours to dry, and then you can go in and very carefully with your hobby knife shave that off and do a little bit of sanding. I would suggest starting with 400 grit. Don't go in too aggressively, because that may be enough to polish it out and get you a good look. I do find that when I'm going to be sanding along seam lines, I like to deepen the panel lines before I do the sanding. That way when I'm finished, there's actually some panel line left and I don't have to do a lot of rescribing. And that's what I did with this model. There weren't any problems with the fit or with seams. It was easy to address, and it came out looking very nicely, I think. This is definitely a model I can recommend to any level of builder, whether you're fairly new to modeling or maybe just new to aircraft modeling, or you're a veteran of the genre. Tamiya is the top of the game when it comes to fit and ease of assembly on any aircraft model kit, in my opinion. So you just about can't go wrong with this. And if I remember right, the price was pretty good too. I want to say it was around $25. So it's not an expensive aircraft model to build at all. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you'll look in the description below, I have links to the various social media platforms that I inhabit. And if you're not already following me there, I would most appreciate if you would sign on to your favorite one and follow me or like or whatever the various service takes for you to keep up with the work that I do. I'm most grateful for that. There's also a link to Patreon, and that is really something that really helps me out. And if you would take a look at what I offer there on Patreon and see if there's a level of support that you would be willing to step up to, I would be most grateful for that. This is the primary way that I support being able to stay in the hobby and do the things that I do and get the materials and the supplies and all of the other things that it takes to do these videos and do these models. So I would be grateful for your consideration. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much for doing that. It's you who make all of this possible. So thank you very much. Well, I hope all of you are safe and healthy. And right now you may have plenty of time to work on your hobby. And so I hope you're doing that and enjoying it, and that it's a great way to pass the time in a very positive way. And while you're doing that, keep in mind, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.